for anybody who's sort of not familiar with, who you are, what you do, where you're coming from, in your pre-compact life, right? You had been involved editorially, running the editorial pages on, I believe, the Wall Street Journal and also the New York Post.
Yeah, I was an editorial writer and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, much of it for the European edition. So I was based in London. There used to be something called Wall Street Journal Europe. They've now just all merged into one global edition. But back when there was a European edition, I was running the opinion page, helping run the opinion pages of that, and which meant I would write most of our editorials, our unsigned editorials on like Europe and Middle East and North Africa for the US edition as well. I then left the Wall Street Journal, but returned to News Corp soon after as the op editor of the New York Post.
Yeah. And I mean, in that position, I have a really hard time imagining, there's got to have been some pretty considerable evolution over the course of all of this, because I've a pretty hard time imagining those two publications endorsing some of what you say in this book.
Yeah, I would say the major evolution took place in circa 2016-17 when I became a Catholic. Catholicism opened up this whole kind of vocabulary of how to think about, communal life, political life that is not individualistic. At heart, it's about the common good. That's the supreme goal of why we form political communities together. And so right about that time also, there were sort of various populist movements, a kind of populist ferment on both sides of the Atlantic, which I then became more and more sympathetic to. The New York Post is slightly more populist than the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal editorial page really is the bastion of, it calls itself conservative, but it's really the kind of neoliberal organ in the country, the most powerful one in some sense, much more doctrinaire, tax cuts, a kind of forward expansionist defense policy, free movement of goods, services, and labor. That's the worldview, and it's almost like there's a set of dogmas that are set, and then new issues come up, and you apply it almost, dogmatically to as the issues come up. Well, the New York Post is more of it has similar tendencies and shares some writers, I think, but it's more populist. It appeals to a different kind of reader. And so I found greater flexibility to explore these ideas within the confines of the New York Post than I did at the Journal. And then, obviously that still there are strictures and there are limits against which I was chafing. So when I found compact, obviously I was much more liberated to say what I really thought and publish the kinds of pieces that I actually, fully, where my heart is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. So, let's talk about where your heart is, because, you're saying that a lot of this came from your conversion to Catholicism and your understanding of Catholic social teachings, which, God knows the American right is full of Catholics who, who pretty much believe in, free markets and aggressive foreign policy. But, regardless, right, you're not one of them. And so that's that's a combination of views that means that, I think, tell me if any of this is unfair, but I think, like, broadly speaking, that, you're somebody who's, socially and culturally conservative. You and I would have sort of, deep and profound moral disagreements about abortion rights and gay and trans rights, and and issues of this nature, maybe even some sort of certainly some questions about how to think about the sort of relationship between religion, morality, and politics, although I'm never quite clear how sort of how far in that direction you go. But there is quite a bit of agreement on the idea that the common, sort of pursuing the common good means at least taking, like at least reversing quite a bit of the kind of neoliberal turn of the last several decades to restore like a much greater degree of labor power, sort of both directly on the shop floor and through and through more a more expansive welfare state to so people don't have to rely on their employers to meet some of their basic needs. Although there's also going to be disagreement on the other end about whether that sort of whether a kind of return to what you sometimes call the New Deal order is kind of a sufficient
or desirable.
Yeah.
No, I think that's fair enough. I as I've been interviewed about this book, or even as it's been reviewed on left of center outlets and podcasts and so on, I think a lot of progressive readers of the book kind of lay that out, and so and I'm often asked like, well, like, so which one do you care more about, or are you this and that? How do you combine the two? And it's almost framed as though my commitments to a relatively more egalitarian order in the in political economy is a departure from my other views. And so I think this is a good place to say that I see them both as coming from the same place. And so it's worth talking about, obviously there was, in the 19th century, the Catholic Church confronted the reality of massive inequality in power and wealth in Europe and in the United States. And this was a product of the Industrial Revolution, which had upset these kind of more patriarchal orders in which the kind of farmer could sustain a family in communities generally characterized by mutual aid and so on and so forth. And you suddenly have millions of people who are proletarianized and urbanized. And the church recognized that the conditions of these people were terrible. And so beginning with Pope Leo XIII in the encyclical Rerum Novarum, the Pope sought, the popes, plural, sought to address this condition. And they were quite realistic. I mean, they, unlike today's American conservatives, they recognized that class antagonism was real and it was acute and getting more acute. But the solution or the vision that they put forward, which I think is reflected in various ways in the experiments in social and Christian democracy in Europe and the New Deal in the United States, is not the total abolition of all hierarchy or emancipation in every direction and so on, but rather a kind of model of class compromise that is a recognition that perhaps hierarchies will always be with us, but that they should be made more humane and that they should be subject to greater political control than sort of unrestricted markets allowed. And that model, obviously, especially in the American tradition, came to be quite influential on a lot of New Dealers. There was a priest named Monsignor Jack Ryan, who came to be known as the Reverend New Deal, who was a great he was awarded a medal by FDR. He was a great influence on FDR's thinking. And so that's kind of what I advocate. And it's actually a testament to the poverty of American conservative thought today in the sort of aftermath of the Reagan Revolution, that all this seems like I'm saying something leftist. I see my political economic project as fundamentally small c conservative in some way. You recognize that markets disrupt a lot if left to their own devices, that they that all that is solid melts into air. So when Marx says that, it's not, there's an element of lament there as well. And so what do? You seek to sort of mitigate that, to bring it under political control. And the best way that we've achieved we've approached being able to strike that kind of control is by raising up the power of the people who are subjected to capital's power. So through especially through the labor union as this kind of indispensable vehicle of working class power, and yes, through some welfare programs as well. And so, yeah, I mean, so I mean, it's very difficult to say, like, well, which part of your mind is like left wing and which part is right wing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess if I wanted to really push that, I mean, I could. I don't think this is necessarily the most interesting thing to talk about, so I don't want to linger on it. But I mean,
Sure.
like, you could, I mean, just like bluntly, right? I mean, you voted for Trump in 2020, right? Like, so that is that's somebody who, well, I don't know that Trump actually agreed with your social views, but at least appointed judges who agreed with them. But Trump was, Trump was a really implacable enemy of your economic views. I mean, his signature policy accomplishment was a tax cut for rich people that also increased taxes on union workers because it taxed union dues. He appointed hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board. He was a really, the Trump administration, I mean, was kind of an orgy of, workplace deregulation. So, it is, I mean, my point in saying this isn't necessarily like, aha, I got you, right? That is more important.
No. I wasn't suggesting you were doing that. It's just that I've been watching a lot of coverage of the book on podcasts and stuff, and I've been trying to articulate something which actually, in a way, it's the conservative critics of the book who really don't get, where you're like, actually, what I'm putting forward is just an older tradition that should be familiar to the right for how to deal with, the turbulence that markets generate.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's so I don't, I will say, on the sort of broader disagreement on social issues, one reason I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight is that during your previous appearance on the show, that's like kind of the bulk of what we talked about. So people can kind of,
yes,
if people want to see us explore that, they can do it there. And I've, written about this, the initial Jacobin thing I did when Compact came out, and, and et cetera. I actually don't think, for the record, that it's inconsistent. I just think it's I just think it's just a worldview I disagree with. But I mean, like, I think it's sort of, I think there is a coherent worldview there. Sure. But in terms of how, alien this is on the right, I mean, it is really remarkable. Like, look, I'm not actually against, I'm not holding my breath. I'm not super optimistic about it, but I mean, if you could actually, convince a bunch of Republican senators that they should support, they should support the PRO Act, so it'd be easier to organize unions, then not only would I be happy with it, I guess I would be happy that you're a right winger, because that would make you better positioned to
right.
do that.
And, right? Well, and to be clear, my goal increasingly on these issues is to push for specific pieces of legislation in which the left, or at least the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, has has taken the leadership and will probably continue to take the leadership. So, for example, there's the PRO Act, there is Senator Warren's Stop Wall Street Looting Act. For viewers who read the book or have read the book, a great deal of the book is about the coercion we've faced from the marketplace. And one of the examples that I cite again and again is the coercive power of Wall Street to hollow out firms in the real economy, lever them up with debt, strip the assets, and ultimately, leave workers and communities holding the bag, even as the hedge funds and private equity funds, pocket all the upside. Warren's Stop Wall Street Looting Act is, kind of a piece of legislation that's out there that would subject takeovers of at least companies that meet a certain threshold in terms of size or number of employees. It would subject them to the kind of deliberation and approval of other stakeholders beyond just sort of the owners of the company, but also, labor, community.
Does that have any Republican support at all right now?
Well, not right now, but it also, frankly, it doesn't have much Democratic support.
No, that's fair. I will say, like, in general, it seems to me that right now, I'm not, like, I know you would, like it to be otherwise, but like right now, even the people who sort of are most rhetorically populist, who hold real positions of power, on the Republican side, people like Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, all of these people strike me as being largely to the right of not just like Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren, but like Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, et cetera, when it comes to these core economic issues. So, for example, none of those people that I just mentioned are on the very long list of co-sponsors of the PRO Act. None of them support Medicare for all. None of them even are even on record as saying we should have, like a $15 minimum wage, which is honestly has been talked about for so long that at this point, I think if you're going to do that in a real way, you'd have to go higher than $15 to achieve the original effect. I
think, as I said, the left, or at least progressive Democrats, will continue to take the lead on these pieces of legislation. But if I and a fairly small, and believe me, like in terms of money and numbers, we are so outgunned by the plutocratic wing of the Republican Party. But if we can, put pressure, and this kind of thing sometimes has worked, to push some Republicans to come around on some of those issues that you mentioned, the project will have been worth it. Especially, I love the history. I love the economic history and the sort of reform history of the United States. And there have been these kinds of interesting coalitional politics that we were capable of as Americans in the past. And I think in the age of intense polarization and everything, we've sort of lost the ability. Although I should say there are like interesting forms of cooperation. As you know, Vance and Warren have teamed up to make sure that we systematically claw back the earnings of banking executives if their banks have to be bailed out. There's like kind of discrete things like that have been happening. But no, as you know, I'm not shy about saying that the Republican Party is very, very, very far from the kind of political economic.
Even to put it like, at the sort of bluntest, like there are people who blurb your book who aren't on board with any of this stuff, like at all, like really, like on a policy level, I think, Marco Rubio's big contribution, when he said he was going to do a big piece of pro-worker legislation was something called the Team Act, which reads to me a lot like a proposal for company unions. That's so it's very hard for me to. Well,
again, it's worth
Sure.
I take your point on that, and I'm actually speaking to you from a hotel room in Washington. I normally live in New York, but The reason I'm in a hotel room in Washington is because I'm doing my DC launch event with Senator Rubio tomorrow, and so and there'll be a labor unionist there, Ashby Crowder and Matt Stoller, who's an antitrust guy. So it'll be a forthright conversation, obviously, and there's disagreements. The reason Marco really supported the book is he has done work on, his office has done work on, serious work on preventing Wall Street corrosion of the real economy. And so you might think that he doesn't go far enough on some labor issues, and I totally agree with you on that, and I'm happy to sort of say that out loud. But they've done a great deal of kind of granular research on the ways in which firms that are either national security sensitive or sensitive to communities, et cetera, are at danger of being taken over by private equity and hedge funds. And so I think that's worth celebrating and just sort of recognizing the nuance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very okay. So I mean, I think there's a conversation to be had about why there is quite as little room, apparently within the Republican Party for, I mean, even if you think that some things are deviations from the, Reaganite orthodoxy of yesteryear, but even for a sort of level of pro-labor politics that you have in the centrist wing of the Democratic Party.
I mean, we can talk about, that's a very interesting question. I'm a great student of Republican politics, and your viewers might find this interesting. I obviously have thought a lot about why the Republican Party is so difficult to shift on this. It's especially surprising given the fact that they're increasingly attracting downscale voters, working class voters. In 2016, Trump won the highest marginal share of union households for any Republican nominee since Ronald Reagan in 1984. In 2020, he kind of consolidated that group, which is the white working class, and even made inroads among working class people of color. So why is it so difficult to have that shifting base, kind of partially shifting base of the two parties translated into policy? I think it's because you can have a voter base in a political party and then have a power base. Those are two separate things. The voter base of the party is increasingly downscale. It's working class. The power base of the Republican Party isn't even big business. I mean, the big business in a complicated way is bipartisan in many ways. The power base of the Republican Party is small and regional capital. It's the guy who owns a chain of car dealerships in a particular region of Ohio or Appalachia, or who owns a chain of tire distribution networks in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. And he goes to the rubber chicken dinners of the Republican Party at the caucus level, at the local level, and the ideology is like toasting the self-made man. And the mentality of that archetypical figure is, in a way, it's that corporations are bad, that he feels oppressed by the turbulence of the market, by the vicissitudes of the market system, and by his sense that larger market actors enjoy a greater degree of government privilege than he does, that if they make a mistake, they'll be fine, but that if he makes a mistake or has a tough year, will fall through an abyss, But his response to that is, first of all, typically ferociously hostile to organized labor, in a way that actually big business isn't nearly as ferocious, right? Because
they're not operating on as tenuous as a margin.
Correct, and they can also, I mean, there's reason for them to think that, if you can have your labor issues hammered out in a kind of mutual way, in a rational way, that's what big business did during the New Deal era, right? There was a kind of tripartite organization, labor, management, and government sit down every year, and they sort of
Right.
negotiate certain things. That's not the case with small and regional capital. You're much more vulnerable. And so your mentality is that it's all privilege that makes larger companies as powerful as they are. And that's not entirely wrong. And so the thing to do is to try to dismantle as much of the state as you can. It's that kind of mentality. That is very powerful in the Republican Party. And so even as it attracts this kind of new group of voters, it hasn't been able to translate it out of translate its policy agenda out of the box drawn for it by small and regional capital.
Yeah, well, that definitely has the ring of truth to it to me. So I do want to transition a bit because I know we have limited time tonight to talk about the kind of broader, the kind of broader philosophical issues about long-term goals that you lay out in the book, because the first half of the book, which I have to say, right, most of the time I've seen you interviewed on other left-wing shows, most of the discussion seems to center around the first half. And so I think I'll mostly refer people to all those discussions. And it's I should say, I mean, look, the first half of the book has essentially nothing I disagree with. I mean, it's all it's a deep dive on the various ways in which the particularly hideous kind of late stage neoliberal capitalism we have in the United States disempowers working class people. You talk about arbitration, you talk about union busting, and quite a few issues of this kind, and where it gets and that's all worth reading. I mean, I should say, I mean, I think people should read this book. They'll get things out of it that'll I think be politically useful to them, and from that first half, that it's a sort of, in terms of like kind of how you would explain to somebody who is really in the grips of this ideology that markets are a bastion of freedom and voluntariness compared to the realm of the state and politics. I think it's like a very very effective kind of journalistic exploration of what's wrong with that in practice. But then in the second half, you talk about, okay, so what we have now is bad, and so what should we have instead? And ultimately, where I'm interested in going is sort of your disagreement with people who are, to your left, like myself. But I think it might be useful to start, because it's going to set it up in an interesting way, with your disagreement with people who are to your right. So you start out this section of the book talking about, like, I don't know, Paul Ryan, I think, talking about how the American tradition is all about equality of opportunity. We don't care about equality of outcomes. Only opportunity. That the American dream is about upward mobility, and that's what our tradition is, not some sort of European socialist nonsense where we care about where you end up at the end of this process. And and one of the things that you point out that I think is really important is that this is at best a pretty brutal oversimplification of the economic views of even, like, the American revolutionaries or various early 19th century leaders. Oh, Sohrab, you're with me?
Yeah, it paused for a second, but now I can.
Okay. Yeah,
I heard all that.
Yeah. So you wanted to speak to that. I mean, like what you think is just historically inaccurate there?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, there's this view that's taken hold on, I would say, both the liberal left and the conservative. Sorry, let me restate that. In the liberal center, in both its kind of conservative and slightly more lefty emanations, that the American tradition is just about equality of opportunity and social mobility. In fact, this is a pretty ahistorical view. The founding generation, obviously, were not total egalitarians, but especially in the Jeffersonian streak of the founding, it was based on this idea that precisely to maintain self-government, you need a citizenry that is modestly propertied, at least, that of a kind of dignified, competent, small r Republican stock should form the majority of the country. And they were very fearful about what it would mean to have a society characterized by, again, not all the founders, certainly Hamiltonians didn't mind, but the Jeffersonian tradition was very fearful of what it would mean to have a society of vast disparities in property ownership. So that Jefferson, for example, said that government should do all it can to ensure that as few people as possible are without a little share of land. Now, of course, there is the obscenity of slavery that a lot of the people who were in the Jeffersonian tradition and who could sound the most radical in some ways in the American tradition were also the ones who were the kind of Virginian Orthodox types who could maintain those views even as they upheld slavery. They bothered their consciences a bit, and they wrote about that, but then they didn't, they wouldn't budge on abolishing it. But nevertheless, I mean, putting aside the sort of racism of that tradition, it had this streak of equality of outcome, actually. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that something more like the Paul Ryan idea of social mobility began to take hold. And that was just when American society had become ever more hierarchical, and its hierarchies had become kind of ironclad and harder to climb, so that the kind of older Jeffersonian equality had become more and more elusive for a greater number of working class Americans. That's when the ideology of social mobility took hold. And then into the 20th century, the idea was that it doesn't matter now if most of the people can't access that kind of modestly property dignity, as long as the ranks of the elites can periodically be refreshed from people who test up, in a way. They take a test or whatever, or they're extraordinary entrepreneurs and they rise up from nothing to the top. And the kind of Horatio Alger mythology takes hold. So that's simply the argument I make there.
I mean,
Christopher Lasch, who notes that social mobility, the language of social mobility, is actually quite recent. It's relatively recent in the American tradition, that it was not on the lips of certainly the founding generation or the early republic.
Yeah, I mean, even in like the 1860s, right? I mean, there's like a famous speech by Abraham Lincoln, where might be the 1850s. I'm not sure about this particular speech, but where he says, he has all these lines about, the sort of importance of labor and capital that, I think some leftists get too excited about and read slightly out of context, but but the core of it is still that he's sort of responding to apologists for slavery who would kind of say, well, look, this like burgeoning northern capitalism is just as bad in its own way, so who are you to judge this? And his defense, which is interesting, is to say, well, people can maybe be wage laborers for a little while, but then they can get like their own little plot of land, they'll have, and then they'll have this independent existence, that he sort of concedes the premise that there's something that's objectionable and maybe even slightly reminiscent of slavery about spending your entire life in the subordinate position. But, frankly, it's probably already a little unrealistic when he was saying it, right? But it's certainly become.
The address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society from 1859. And he is defending the free labor model, the capitalist model of organizing labor, against attacks from the South, as you just said. But exactly right. The ideal he puts forward is that there won't be for long any kind of permanent distinctions between the classes, because the person who's now a penniless beginner in the world will soon rise up. He'll toil and he'll earn enough money to buy his own tool and buy his own land, and then he'll become an owner, and he'll hire someone else, and that person. But I mean, I think already when you get to that speech by Lincoln, you're getting apologetics for. I mean, I certainly agree with
Sure.
him that free labor
Yeah.
is better than slavery, but you're already getting to the world of a fantastical political economy. In other words, Lincoln was saying that in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, when social mobility was already beginning to grind down in American society by the Jacksonian era. So by the time he's saying this, he's projecting, that older Jeffersonian ideal onto an economy that doesn't really work that way anymore. That is already sort of beginning to be sharply bifurcated between people who have assets and they're relatively few in number, and people who lack assets and are the numeric majority and have to rely on selling their labor power to make ends meet and survive.
Yeah. So, I mean, this I think gets to the real nub of disagreement that you and I have, because I mean, I think that point about the early American tradition is important, but then if you think about that and you say, well, okay, if it is important that people have a certain kind of autonomy, that that they have a certain kind of control over their labor, and you can, and in any kind of modern economy, that it's just not realistic to think that most people are going to be either small farmers or like independent
Mini
urban entrepreneurs.
capitalists.
Yeah, exactly. Petty capitalists, that you have an economy that's organized in such a way that there just are going to be, I mean, any business where you have, at least several people working together, that there is, therefore, if it's privately owned, that you are going to then get this exact class distinction that you're talking about, right? So from my perspective, that shift, is a sort of very good reason to think that the North Star of what we consider justice should be collective ownership. So you don't have that kind of class division, and it's not for you. And I want to explore that. And in setting that up, I do want to say that there are, and you make this distinction right in this part of the book, but just to underline it, there are a couple of different critiques that are worth separating out here. So one of those would be a sort of I don't know, like maybe for example, like a certain strain of Orthodox Marxism might say that you just can't have like kind of long-term class compromise because of not necessarily just for political reasons, but for just
macroeconomic reasons.
Yeah, for macroeconomic ones, that maybe the falling rate of profit means that you can't have it over the course of time or something like that. And that actually wouldn't necessarily be my point. I think that actually some of the points you make about this in your book are good ones, that when you look around the world and see different countries, that there's been at least some neoliberal push almost everywhere, but there are plenty of places in the world where by American standards there's still incredibly robust social democracy in 2023, which suggests that a lot of this is really about politics and sort of comparative kind of strength of different class forces in different places, more than those kinds of large scale macroeconomic reasons. Yeah. And frankly, I mean, I'm not really necessarily a big falling rate of profit guy. Whenever I hear that, like it always starts to remind me of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are perpetually putting off the end of the world because they realize they miscalculated or something. There's always an explanation of why, the rate of profit recalibrated, and at some point in the past. But
no, but your point is, if I may try to restate it, your objection is not the class compromise is bound to be temporary or whatever, that you can see that the fact that it's held up in some places to a greater degree than others shows that it's more contingent, and it's not inevitable that it wasn't inevitable that the New Deal order should be vitiated by kind of Reagan types and Clinton types, and therefore that it's maybe possible macroeconomically to restore some measure of it, which I think, in calling for that, I do think I'm pushing on a half open door, because we're entering a different stage in the global development of capitalism, where we're returning to sort of regional power centers, and everyone is anxious to bring in manufacturing closer to our own shores. So all that, what I'm saying is, tends toward tighter labor markets. And so
look, I don't I don't necessarily think.
So you're not mounting that critique.
Yeah, I'm not mounting that critique. I don't think
your critique is something like, if you're concerned about this problem of the disparity about like what democratic ideals we aspire to on the one hand, and the fact of alienated labor, that therefore the best way to resolve that is to once and for all eliminate alienated labor, and so and bring production fully and rationally under collective control, which I think is am I stating that well?
No, I think that's right. So that's I mean, I think I would ultimately say, because look, I don't, I mean, I would like, I mean, I think that like some class compromise would be a great improvement over the sort of lack of, I'd rather have a slightly more favorable compromise with my enemies than be completely defeated by them. If I'm presented with those two choices, I would love some social democracy. I'm what the sort of old school social democrats, back when that word had different connotations, would call the minimum program. I think we probably have a lot of agreement. But then on the question of, okay, well, why not just stop there? Why not see that as the end goal? I would basically say two things. One is pragmatic and one is principle. The pragmatic one is, even if it's not macroeconomically impossible, there is some degree, I think, of political instability, just because you have, if you have a class of people who have a lot of economic power and, will always look for ways to translate that into political power, who would benefit from renegotiating that compromise in a way that's more beneficial to them. There's always going to be some pull in that direction. So I think you have some degree of political instability from that. And I think we can see how that's played out. I mean, in that very neoliberal revolution that you're deploring. So that's the pragmatic point. But then, I think what you said is exactly right about the principal point, which is, hey, why do we need to resign ourselves to a economy being run in this way, such that there is a class of there's a class of asset owners and an assetless class of people who have to sort of subject themselves to private power. And yes, I agree, if we do all the sort of everything that sort of Galbraith inspired, you say in the second half of the book, that we need countervailing power. Countervailing power is nice, but I would prefer not to have this economic system that seems fundamentally at odds with those democratic ideals.
Yeah, so I think here is where we get really, really philosophical, and I think several answers to that. One is, I can't get into enormous amount of depth on it. I think there is a morality to that not all private property as such is immoral. And so if we agree that not all private property is immoral, but has come naturally to, no, I shouldn't say naturally, but is a kind of historical institution that has been so prevalent over the long course of human history. Now, capital is a relatively modern instantiation of it, and it can be very radical and destructive in ways that maybe older forms of private ownership weren't. That the attempt to utterly get rid of this institution on a mass scale cannot but be either extremely destructive, in trying to mount it. And that, or even if it's achieved, that it will come at the cost of raising up new elites who will not be necessarily property elites, but who will wield political authority with just as much ruthlessness as a capitalist might, in order to preserve its power. And so, I mean, I think that's my kind of deepest philosophical.
Well, let's explore that a little bit, because I mean, is your premise there that it's just impossible to have collective ownership? And to be clear, I mean, I think you mean this, but just to make sure that nobody's listening is getting it wrong. When we talk about private property, we're talking about something very, very specific, right? We don't mean private property in cars and the and I don't know, the Criterion DVD collections and all that stuff, right? We mean private property in the means of social production, in things like factories and and farms and things of that nature. And so, is your position that for some reason collective ownership of those things is just incompatible with political democracy?
No, I mean, I'm willing to grant nationalization in specific areas, right? So, for example, I think healthcare is one of those areas that should be collectively owned, and that's why I'm for Medicare for all, and happy to fend off any conservative challenge to that. There are various kind of transport industries where there's no reason why they should. I mean, in fact, like, you compare Britain's national rail service when it was one unified system, whereas what they have now, which is under this kind of messy competitive model, and you're constantly jumping train lines, and it's far less efficient. So, when it comes to kind of mass scale social organization, there are perfectly many things that one can contemplate putting in public management and public hands as opposed to private hands. But I think a general collectivization of all social organization, that strikes my, you could call it my historical sense or my conservative sense, that is going to come at a very high cost of social kind of calamity. And here I cannot but point to kind of the experiments in building classless societies in the 20th century that ended horrifically. Now, I know, I before you stop me, I know that you are a democratic socialist, and so you're not a Leninist or whatever. But I just cannot see how that such an order, even if it were desirable, could be brought about, like mass general collectivization of all modes of social organization, as opposed to what like social democrats and Christian Democrats achieved in a more kind of discrete way in Europe, which is like, okay, rail we nationalize, health we nationalize, etc. Not everything. Even if it were desirable to have general collectivization, how that would be brought about without the sort of disruptive, calamitous violence that you, as in the democratic half of your commitments, would find abhorrent. Given the fact, because then, you're talking about, well, okay, the large enterprise, let me grant that all large enterprise be collectivized. At some point you have to say, well, why could there be, small ownership? And
hold on. Let's linger on that thought. Like, I mean, that's would that be something you would grant?
What's that? General
the general collectivization
of
large enterprises. Like let's say
no, because I think in some areas we
nationalize the Fortune 500, for example. Like that's
I think in some areas we've seen, I mean, this is why I'm not a full-on socialist, but we've seen in some areas we've seen over the course of the 20th century that markets do allocate things more efficiently, and that it's a total degree of centralization of human economic activity can be deadening, and lead to deprivation and so on. So I'm not,
Okay,
but
so
I'm willing to. But this is, I mean, I think this is the beauty of this kind of managed capitalist model, is that you approach things with a degree of pragmatism, and you say, what do markets do well? Where do they need to be disciplined so that they don't create market failure or that they harm the community and so on? And where do they totally not belong, like healthcare or water rights or any number of common goods, emergency services, firefighting, national defense? There's all sorts of things where they just don't belong. And here we're happy to grant, state or collective ownership. And so I think the view I'm putting forward is seems less consistent, but it's also has the benefit of a kind of non-absolutizing pragmatism.
Yeah, well, let me just say a little bit more, and on behalf of somewhat absolutizing idealism, I think that if the defense I just heard, right, of private ownership of like very large companies, right, like Fortune 500 companies, in some cases, not all, right, you think there are sectors that should be decommodified. Fair enough, we agree on that. But is that in some sectors, you might need markets to avoid kinds of undesirable inefficiencies.
We're
Okay.
this technological sort of, you don't want to produce things just a certain way over and against technological development just to maintain.
I mean, I'm surely that technological development is already to a very great extent a product of the public sector. I mean, if you read stuff like Mariana Mazzucato, the Entrepreneurial State, she kind of goes through, everything about the like a smartphone that, that makes it smart, and you kind of pull back those threads, and it turns out that it's always like, either like the Defense Department or, some public university lab, these are all the places that all.
No, I grant that. I think in all of the kind of major achievements of America's multiple waves of industrial revolutions, from the Hamiltonian state, barring barring the sort of export of barring the import of British manufactured goods, in order to essentially doing import substitution so that American domestic industry could develop, to the nuclear age, to the space age, to now the sort of digital age. All of these in the American context, and I think globally as well, I totally grant that. I think they're the product of this kind of dynamism of market and government in a kind of dynamic fusion with each other, which is why I find kind of libertarian ideology moronic, because, as you say, and so I think that's why I'm a kind of state-managed capitalist or socially managed capitalist, is precisely because I recognize that states have an enormous role to play in fostering innovation and so forth. But in at least the most dynamic economies that have developed, including now you might say China as an example, it's been this kind of fusion of state and market. Whereas the Soviet Union, did achieve some important things, but began to sort of lag dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Soviet Union is not a promising model for what a collectivized economy could look like. But if you say that, okay, so you need for dynamism to avoid certain inefficiencies in some sectors of the economy, you need some market mechanisms, and that's the reason to want to keep even some very large companies in private hands. I mean, one thing I would suggest is that there are two distinct issues there. Mm-hmm. One is about capitalist property relations. In other words, do you have Do you have private ownership such that you have this division of a class of asset holders and a assetless class of wage laborers? And then the other question is, are there markets? And those can come apart, right? I mean, you can so if you look at like the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque Country of Spain, you have this thriving 80,000 member essentially federation of worker co-ops there that and in the Emilia Romagna area of Italy, you have cases like this too, right? That like have that even though it would take sort of a unprecedented level of state policy to take it to more than a very small portion of the economy. I mean, like you could, if let's say you take you get you have expropriated, and I guess we can disagree about whether there's any scenario in which this has happened without without horrendous violence, but let's say we're talking about we're talking about some sort of process. I think you'd probably be starting with pretty maximalist social democracy, and then pushing it to a point where you had to expropriate a lot of the private economy to keep going after that. And if you said, all right, we've expropriated Fortune 500 companies, some of them are things that we want to just directly, we want to just entirely decommodify, like health insurers and et cetera, right? But the incentives of a worker-owned health insurance company wouldn't be any better than the incentives of a regular health insurance company. But there are these other things that, okay, we think market mechanisms need to play some role. We need price signals and firm failure and all of that stuff. Okay, fine. But you could have all of that stuff in those sectors consistent with worker ownership, and the transition to that would certainly violate capitalist property rights if you have a moral objection to that, but it wouldn't necessarily go against the markets can play useful roles argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, what you just outlined, that vision you outlined there of, I guess, gradual expropriation. Again, now I'm going to sound like the cynical capitalist realist here, and I don't mean to, but it sounds, implausible to me. I mean, it's like, I visited that village in Spain. There's a village in Spain called Marina Lida that produces things, like you said. It doesn't have capitalist relations of production because it, if you move into the town, you immediately get a social income, and you have to participate in production, and then it produces for the market, right? So it's kind of what you're talking about. But that social income that people get for moving there is actually a product of like EU subsidies. So it's actually just like German capitalism that actually funds it. So this all seems to go from that to expropriation, democratic expropriation of the Fortune 500, just seems like step one: start a co-op that's supported by the state. Middle step, question mark. Step three, democratically expropriate the Fortune 500. Just seems really implausible to me.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
But okay. I mean, let's say that that's because we're not talking about necessarily just what's the practical plan. We're talking about the kind of deeper philosophical issues. Let's say that it were possible and achievable in any kind of nonviolent, or at least not massively violent way. The question is, have you therefore gotten rid of social hierarchies? And I would venture to say that no, because someone, just because of the way things are organized in human affairs, someone will then be under this new order, will then be the kind of manager. You can give him a non-hierarchical name as much as you want, but the function will be hierarchical, and others will be lower down that hierarchy. And so the fundamental problem that you and I set out to solve when we embarked on this kind of these thought experiments of trying to reconcile.
Well, but let's think about this a little bit, right? So if the argument is, look, are you going to have, if we had a economy where I mean, I don't want to be misleading here. I mean, like, I would personally like to collectivize much more than just the Fortune 500, but I mean, like, just for the sake of, how you set this up originally, that's, if we had a economy where there are no large scale businesses with capitalist property relations, that everything is either sort of, under some kind of like decommodified full state ownership, or is in a, residual market sector of worker owned firms. Okay, look, just because you have worker ownership doesn't mean that you don't have managers. You're right. I mean, you have managers at Mondragon, etc. I think that there are some management functions that are actually, socially useful, that, people have, specialized technical knowledge, etc. Fair enough. But if the argument is, well, if we did achieve this, and this is what we're arguing about, whether, I mean, we can have a separate argument about whether, achieving this would be worth the cost or not. I mean, right, that's kind of what you've raised a couple of times, but I mean, just to focus on whether this is even a sort of desirable long-term goal. And if your argument that it's not is, well, you'd still have, something that you could reasonably call hierarchy would still exist. Therefore, since there's going to be hierarchy one way or the other, so isn't it sort of good enough to tame hierarchy in this like Galbraithian way that you have countervailing power from unions and from a social democratic state? Then I would just suggest that, it's a little bit like a parallel argument you can make in the political sphere about whether like a constitutional monarchy, not like the kind of constitutional monarchy they have in Britain today, where that just it's like more or less purely symbolic in practice, but like a real constitutional monarchy where there's a hereditary monarch who's actually making decisions. That if we're arguing about whether, let's say we're starting with an absolute monarchy, and we're trying to decide whether the goal should be a continued hereditary monarchy where the monarch is somewhat constrained by parliament and a Bill of Rights and things like that, or whether democracy would be better than that, whether we shouldn't actually have political decisions being made by a hereditary monarchy. I mean, you could run the parallel argument here that it's like, hey, just because we have democracy doesn't mean that everybody has a totally equal amount of political power. There are still politicians, etc., who, not everybody is a politician. Not everybody exerts the same amount of political influence. But, I would say that there's still a sort of fundamentally objectionably undemocratic thing about somebody being a monarch, even if their power is somewhat constrained. And similarly here, yeah, sure. Do you have perfect equality of power in any system? Probably not. But again, some people have, even if everything's run by workers' councils, some people are actually sitting on them and other people are just voting about, for them, etc. But even so, is it important? Is there something that's like intrinsically desirable about everybody who's exercising power being sort of directly, being democratically accountable to the people who they're exercising power over? That sure, they're exercising power, but at least you can vote them out, that you actually have that kind of direct voice in the system. And and it does seem to me that the same way it's objectionable for some people to be exercising power in the political realm without anybody voting for them, without anything but them happening to be born into this one special family. That there's something objectionable in itself about the idea that that you get to exercise a bunch of power, and even with a bunch of Galbraithian countervailing power, you're still exercising a bunch of power as a business owner, just because perhaps you inherited the business from your dad, just like a king could inherit the kingdom from his dad.
Yeah, and I would just say that I don't want to press on this point too much, but you could easily, let's say we've achieved the society that you've described, you can easily see the resentment of people who are, merely, voting for the Workers' Council versus those who, are in the inner party of the Workers' Council. And saying,
sure,
well, why should they, or,
say about political democracy.
And also, right? I mean,
but I mean, the difference,
like why
monarchy matters.
Yeah, I mean, why? I wondered, like, why should the people on the Workers' Council then, why should they give up power once they have it, right? And what's to ensure that that they won't? Now they could obviously you could have a system that in which they, there are mechanisms for ensuring that doing this and that. But then,
sometimes people who win democratic elections in the political sphere don't give up power; they stage coups or something. But it's still, it's still good. There is a normatively important difference. I think you would agree in the political sphere between a somewhat constrained monarchy with some countervailing power from below and democracy. That the second of those options is really importantly better than the first one. Or maybe not.
Well, I think there are situations, and I can imagine historically in which certainly constitutional monarchs can, just by the symbolic role that they play, can stabilize social antagonisms that would otherwise be enormously destructive to societies. We can think about historical examples of this. They failed to do it, but one historical example that you'd be sympathetic to is the fact that in Britain, when the nobles, the kind of enterprising nobles, went about enclosing common lands and basically turning them into privately owned farms, it was the crown, it was the British crown, or the English crown, I should say, that opposed them, so that there was this strange alliance of the crown and the peasants over and against the kind of socially disruptive bourgeoisie, or kind of proto-bourgeoisie that was emerging during the enclosure controversy. So my point in all this, I guess this is my there's a kind of what I see as the realist streak in my thinking, which is that in the society that you describe, despite whatever its sort of formal aspirations might be, in substance, you can easily foresee the emergence of kind of anti-democratic centers of power that then breed resentment, that resist reform, et cetera, et cetera. And again, remember, and if that's at all possible, and if you have, as I do, at least somewhat a shaded or dimmer view of what human nature can be like, then to think, is it worth it to massively disrupt our societies? And I'm convinced that the society that you describe would involve I just don't think it would be a peaceful transition.
Okay, so there are two separate questions here, right? So
I understand, but I'm saying, like, if you have a more cynical view of human nature, as I do, and I think we get into where that comes from, it could, not just theological reasons like the fall or something like that, but just looking at the course of human history, you might be more skeptical than you are. One might be more skeptical than you are about the possibilities of a system like you describe, nevertheless falling in thrall to the power of a small clique or of a dictator and so on and so forth.
Sure,
in which case, why the potential sort of massive cataclysmic disruption of property relations in a much more dramatic way than I think most people today would be prepared to at all even begin to contemplate, in order to get to something where you could have new forms of dictatorship.
I mean, it's possible. They have I mean, I think that you can, I mean, I would argue that the sort of corruptibility of human nature is a reason to try to make institutions as democratic as they could possibly be, consistent with other goals, right? That the less you trust one human being to exercise power over another without cruelty, etc. So I mean, it's like I'm the atheist in this conversation, but I actually kind of think original sin is on my side. I would think that having look, I mean, is it possible that we could make our institutions much more democratic than they are by eliminating this kind of private power that not just countervailing it, but eliminating it as a long-term goal. This private power that has that creates all this potential for abuse, etc., as documented in your book. Is it possible that even if we've made institutions much more democratic by extending democracy into the workplace, that that there are various ways in which in which that wouldn't be you wouldn't have eliminated all sources of power, or all possibilities of something undemocratic arising, perhaps, right? But I mean, that doesn't in itself strike me as a very good reason not to push for that greater degree of private power, of democracy.
And you're not given any pause by the sort of experience in the 20th century of attempting to democratize everything in the way that
I wouldn't really describe that as what was being attempted there. I mean, like, I think maybe you could argue it's a sort of being attempted for a few months in Petrograd, late 1917, early 1918. But that's certainly in the rest of those cases, I mean, you're talking about very self-conscious attempts to emulate an already established model. And I think there's tons of stuff you can learn from the negative lessons about that experience, about the needs of, I mean, I think both on an economic level, what they did wrong, that that you can learn from, and also the fact that sort of dismissing kind of robust protections of civil liberties and free speech and multi-party elections and everything is this kind of bourgeois smokescreen for power that isn't important, because we all know that it's always exercising class power anyway is a huge mistake, right? And that you do need those more robust institutions. So I think there's lots of stuff you can learn from it. But I mean, I think that just saying that therefore the inequality of power that you get in capitalist institutions is not a big deal. That we shouldn't strive to get rid of that, or even just the inequality and distribution of wealth that is if everything you want happened, I mean, we'd certainly have much less of it. But also, if you inherit a large business from your dad, right, you are going to have a much better life, not due to anything that you did, any choice that you made, than other people who were simply born in less fortunate circumstances. And that's true even if we have much more powerful unions and social democracy and
I would just point out that the best we've done, and I really mean it as a species, across our long history, the best we've done at compressing the sort of disparities that otherwise exist between generations and between classes of people, a sense of like the example that you repeatedly bring up of like the guy who inherited a factory or whatever. The best we've done has been under a situation of bringing capitalism under political control, during the sort of New Deal era or the social democratic era. It has not been the attempts at totally classless societies that uplifted working class people, and as a result did something to bring about what's called the Great Compression, right? This sort of that the disparity between the two classes was sort of at its narrowest point, was squeezed the most.
Look, I think
within the context of managed markets and not within the context of
I'm not suggesting we try to recreate the Soviet Union, but I think
I understand that you're not.
But I think that
it says something.
I think the best we've done should not necessarily be the outer limit of the best we can do, but we could keep. I'm sure that we could do another hour of this very easily.
I was supposed to get off like half an hour ago, but I was enjoying the conversation. It's worthwhile because many people who champion class compromise as the outer limit of their politics think of themselves as progressives, and as this conversation made it clear,
how much of a reactionary it makes you.
No, just that the class compromise is ultimately an attempt. There's in it this recognition that this might be the best we can do, and I think this kind of generation of post-war leaders I admire a great deal. Some of them conservative, many of them progressive, or people who are figures who are pretty hard to categorize, like Galbraith, who looked at the Soviet Union, who looked at the miseries of 19th century capitalism, who looked at what working class people were like and wanted, and said, this is a good attempt. This is reasonable, and I think that lays down a roadmap that avoids the sort of the shoals of both kind of absolute idealisms of full socialism or market fundamentalism.
All right. Well, I disagree, but
I know you do.
but I do. I'm unswayed, but I do like the book, and tell Marco to co-sponsor the Pro Act.
I will explicitly say that, and I'll say my friend Ben said so.
Okay, sounds good.
Cheers.
All right. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.